Welcome, everyone. We are here with Sky Nelson Isaacs, who I had an opportunity to meet at the SAND conference when it was live and running in San Jose for so many years. And I used to go and watch his talks, right, on physics and synchronicity and flow, and have been wanting to interview him for a while. And we didn't get around to it until I finished his latest book, which we're going to touch upon today. So thanks for being here, Sky.
My pleasure, Renee. It's been a long time coming, and I forgot that we met at SAND, so that's a good refresher.
Yeah, one of my favorite conferences. So before we get started, I would love to give people a little bit of an overview about you so they know where you come from. Sky's a physics educator, a speaker, an author, and a musician, and a really good musician too, because I've heard him play various instruments. His master's is in physics, and his thesis was on string theory, but I don't think we're going to go too deep into that today. Thank God. Sky is also the founder of the Synchronicity Institute, which seeks the science behind synchronicity and develops practical tools for navigating change. Sky has dedicated his life to finding his own sense of purpose, which is certainly woven throughout his books, beginning as a student of a yogic master as early as 5 years old, right? Which is really profound. His writing on topics like flow comes from integrating this experience into his life, and he brings together the connection between synchronicity, physics, and practical things in life using both research and original ideas. An educator with 9 years of classroom experience with experience in the industry as a software engineer, he's also a multi-instrumentalist and professional performer of award-winning original musical compositions. So again, welcome. Yay, I know. Maybe we can hear a little bit of that.
No, I'm nervous.
Yeah, well, I mean, we were chatting before the recording started, and I was smiling last night because I was listening to you talk about one of your workshops, and you were singing it on keyboard.
It takes all different types.
It does indeed. So those of you who want to hear, check Sky out on YouTube, and we'll put a link for you all so you can listen to some of that music. So speaking of music, let's rewind the clock a little bit, right? I mean, after all, who has a yoga guru at 5 years old? And, also from your physics background, right? You have all of this creative side through music. So tell us how working with a yoga guru at 5 years old unfolded for you.
I wouldn't say I was working with him. And I realized it was younger than that. I was about 2 when I met Satchidananda. Because my mom got married to my stepdad. My stepdad had followed Satchidananda from Woodstock onward. And I think of Satchidananda as like a father figure. I have many memories of being in his community as a kid, like irreverent kid doing crazy kid stuff. I wasn't doing pujas and meditating, but I was absorbing the message, the message of truth is one, paths are many, of diversity of thought, and diversity of religion. And also this core idea that there's something underneath the surface that's going on. And if there's some way in which life makes sense, it may not be fair or clear, but there is an order to it that we don't see, which is something that comes out in the work of karma in Hindu traditions. And so the ideas of karma and Maya, or illusion, are very close to my heart in terms of the way I approach the world, trying to get at what is the hidden information here that I can't see, which might be unfolding. And that eventually sometimes comes out as synchronicity, right? The person that you meet and you don't realize you have anything in common, and you realize you knew somebody in common 10 years ago who's like a best friend, and you have this hidden information that surfaces, and you realize it's a synchronicity. So it all ties back to the original work that I learned from Satchidananda's tradition of integral yoga that comes from thousands of years of Bhagavad Gita and the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, some of those great books. But Satchidananda was like a father figure to me. I have a lot of love and appreciation and sweetness when I think about what I got from that relationship with that community.
I think it's amazing that you were introduced to such a master at such a young age, right? And to have that influence where so many are, grow up being indoctrinated by one religion, right? And not knowing that there's many paths to truth and enlightenment.
Well, my family was kind of the same way in terms of many paths. My parents separated when I was young. In one family, I had a spiritual path with Satchidananda. My dad's family, he came from a tradition of his grandfather was a rabbinical scholar who abandoned Judaism for various reasons that were personal to him. So my grandmother and my dad grew up very scientifically minded, very non-religious practicing, but we were Jewish. And I had 5 brothers and sisters. I was kind of the middle child in one family and the older child in another family, and just had all these diverse experiences between these 2 families that really gave me the sense that there's no right way. There's a lot of different ways to do who we are. And that, how do we come through as human beings within that diversity without a judgment that we have to be like somebody else or even like the environment that we're in, but that we get to be ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. If only children could understand that early on, right? We wouldn't constantly have to be going through so many dark nights of the soul.
And I think that I didn't know that growing up. I felt like I had to conform and be like to different people I was around. And I absorbed a lot of their intentions and expectations. But as I've gone through my dark night of the soul as an adult, I've looked back and reflected and said, oh, what I actually got from that experience was how many different ways there are. And so over the course of my lifetime, it's been educational, not necessarily in the moment.
So before you knew the word physics even existed, right? What was the catalyst that kind of took you along that path, right? And more importantly, why?
Well, the work as a spiritual studier in my teenage years when I found the Tao Te Ching, the Tao Te Ching is a really existential book. I was really interested in philosophy. And I was asking these questions about what is the nature of reality? I saw, my family, my parents going through some pain, and asked myself, is there some purpose to that? Or is it just accidental? And so the yogic tradition is about cause and effect, but not necessarily that you can see, not causal cause and effect, but acausal cause and effect in a way, a meaningful interaction of our intentions and our karma with what we actually, our circumstances. So when I discovered, I wasn't planning to be a physicist, but I did love it. I read a lot of interesting books like Brian Greene's Elegant Universe.
Great book.
I loved, Richard Feynman. But in college, I injured my hands. I was a music major, and my hands had like repetitive stress injuries. So I had to switch majors, and sort of synchronistically fell into, just was like, I was in this astronomy class, which I was really enjoying for fun. And I remembered that I liked physics in college. So, in high school. So I switched, and I spent a semester catching up. And then sophomore year, from then on out, I was a physics major. And I loved it. I found a deep love for studying the underlying laws of the cosmos in the same way that I had found love for spiritual laws.
Which kind of brings us to that bridge. I think one of the things that I really love about your work is that you really do create that bridge between spirituality and science, right? Which is what this whole series is about. So let's talk about the word flow. You reference a quote from a Hungarian-American psychologist with a name that's pretty complicated to say.
Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi.
Well done. So he said that flow is not about giving up control or letting go of your power. It's about letting go of the worry about being in control. So why don't we start there?
It's a deep concept. It's shifting away from the polarity of should I do this or should I do that? Should I be more spiritual or should I be more scientific? That's kind of the same question. Should I be more assertive or more receptive? My tendency is to want to speak up. Should I maybe hang back? Like all these polarities of how we think we should be. And what really struck me about Csikszentmihalyi's point there is there's no right answer. And the reason flow is hard is because there's not a solution set that you can find to answer every situation. It's about letting go of the worry that you even have the answers and feeling into your body and your emotions and your mind, your thinking. Like, what's the coherence that I'm bringing right now that I want to share? Like, do I want to hang back or do I want to speak? And what's the balance there for me? So there's a dynamism that I think is really freeing and never ending, like, mastery of that.
You're really speaking about surrender.
Well, surrender is part of that polarity in my mind, the way I use the word, right? Because there's the surrender or the take charge. So sometimes maybe you mean surrender in a different way.
Well, I mean surrender in the way that all the ancient sages and masters speak about, right? Surrendering into the flow rather than trying to resist, right? Pema Chodron talks about this a lot. Where we stop resisting life, we go with the flow and we surrender into that synergy.
Yeah, so we're stop resisting life, but we don't stop resisting circumstances. So sometimes being in flow means saying, I don't want to go to that movie. My truth is I've already seen that movie, or it's going to affect me in a way that I'm scared about, or whatever. I'm bored by it, and I want to voice my opinion. So that's what I think is great about Csikszentmihalyi's point, is that we surrender to the fact that we're in an argument right now. Like, that's surrendering to life, not necessarily surrendering our point of view or our opinion or our desires. Is that a distinction that makes useful sense?
Yeah, I think that's a good distinction. I mean, you're talking about healthy boundaries, right? So healthy boundaries so that we make healthy choices that serve us in each and every moment, rather than plugging into a way that we've been conditioned to be, which is someone else's rules.
Right. And so spirituality is not about surrendering to other people or just letting life run over you. It is really a dynamic, impossible to pin down process that we can surrender to that process.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, actually. And actually, this is a really good segue to something I wanted to read from your first book, Living in Flow.
Amazing.
Which is also, I think, an evergreen book. So even though I think it was only 2019, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's really not that old, but definitely evergreen. And there's a beautiful excerpt here that I'm going to read, and then you can comment on it, which brings us back to synchronicity. Just as water avoids the extreme peaks and flows in the middle of a valley, flow lives in the middle path. On this path, we honor our outer need for material abundance, for what it can teach us, and delight what it can bring for us. But we also honor that internal compass, right? The internal need for meaningful experiences, for the richness and color that they bring to our lives. You say that flow helps us find a deeper sense of dynamic safety in the world, even when our outer circumstances feel uncertain, right? And that's when a lot of people plug into fear. You suggest that this shift to flow consciousness can support a worldwide renaissance in creativity, which I loved, and that synchronicity makes things possible, but it's up to us to actually make them actual. I thought that was just awesome, by the way, because it's bringing it full circle. It's talking about that we are participants, right? We have to engage in the world. We can't just, have this intention and flow, let it flow to the universe and expect the universe to do everything without our participation.
Right. We're not just surrendering to the circumstances.
Right.
Well, let me tell a story that's really from last night, a really, really current story that illustrates synchronicity and how it unfolded in my life. Because sometimes there are simple examples that might be like super material. Like I have a friend who found a ring and had to, figure out what the stone was. And that's one type of synchronicity. Or meeting someone, like I met my wife by accident in Paris one time, and that story is like in my course and on my blog and everything. But just last night, I had this really powerful experience of growth synchronicity, where I was planning. I'm home for a couple of days. Like I have this little brief period of time to rest, and I have an Aikido class every Monday, which is beginner's Aikido. And I took Aikido as a kid, and I'm started taking it again last year, and I'm still quite bad at it. I wait for the Monday night beginner class, and it's humbling, how much it makes me work to connect what my mind is wanting to do and what my body is wanting to do. And I just had this intuition, like on one hand, that I should go even though I don't want to go. Like I said, I was going to go, and I should go. On the other hand, my foot's injured, and I was sensing that I needed to rest. And so I was sort of stuck between this polarity, right? Do I take charge, or do I surrender? And I ended up feeling very self-compassionate, and I decided to rest. And I woke up about 10 minutes before the end of the first Aikido class.
Like 10 minutes before the end of the first. Okay.
It was obviously too late to go, right? And I had a dream that was disappointing. Like I should have gone. Like sort of a stressful conflict with myself in the dream. And so I woke up feeling like, I should have gone to this class. And what that triggered in me was a sense of very familiar tension, confusion, inability to resolve it. Like really keep thinking I should have gone, but I can't go, or maybe I still should go. Like that was still an option.
It's also self-judgment, right? We're judging ourselves.
Yeah, totally. And that's a very, for me, that has a long history of like how my life has unfolded and how I respond to situations. So I found myself surprisingly, like in this dark place, dealing with a situation I just don't know how to handle for myself. And it's pretty simple. Like no, there's no consequence, but it felt consequential to me, right? So instead of I felt myself almost like collapse onto the bed and just sit down and just collapse, like frustrated and disappointed and all that. And welcome in the disappointment, welcome in the self-judgment, And then I was like, that's not the future, right? I've done that so many times. What else can I do? And from the various things I've been practicing, I sort of had a solution. I'm going to get in the car. I'm going to go. I don't know what the gift is. I might miss the class. I'm actually not so much interested in the class anyway, but I'm interested in this community. So maybe there's still people going to be hanging out. I just don't. This is a key piece that I've learned about synchronicity. I don't know what the circumstances really are. So I don't want to prejudge what's possible. And by being aware that I'm not really key on like having an Aikido class, I'm more interested in a deeper like social connection that allowed me to let go of the thinking that there was no possible way to make it happen and open up to like, what can I still do? And it felt really good for me to just decide I'm still going to go, even if I waste my time. I'm going to accept that I might waste my time. So there's a piece here about like accepting this painful idea that I might waste my time, but it's going to solve my indecisiveness and allow me to move forward and re-engage with my essence, right? And just be present to who I am in a positive way. So I got in the car, I drove there, and I arrived, and I was already dressed in my gi, my uniform. And I walk in and they're bowing out, which means they're like closing the class. And I just kind of smiled. I was disappointed, not surprised. And I was able to actually access a deeper joy at that point because I knew that I was walking into that situation. So I freed myself from my agony that had been with me for days, actually, and was like, I already screwed this up completely, but here I am, I'm present. And as I helped sweep the mat and showed up in conversation, like for announcements, I was more present than I usually am. And one of the other students there asked if I was going to stick around to practice after class. And I said, yeah, if you want to. So we ended up practicing. She's a total novice like me. And we really struggle in class to learn stuff because things go so fast. we spent an hour together fumbling around with basic moves that we learned in class, doing it wrong again and again, and finding new ways that actually felt better for us. It's like allowing ourselves to learn together. And there was some really, like, she learned how to fall in a new way that was really healing for her. And I learned how to be present with my like, I'm afraid of hurting someone. So I was able to like actually drop in my body and not be afraid of hurting them. We came away both feeling like this was the most amazing yoga, Aikido class we've had. We learned,
Wow.
we were both healed by it. And it wasn't intentional. It was just a gift that emerged out of the situation.
Yeah, I think that's, the idea of looking for what's possible rather than what's not possible.
Right. Yeah. And what's possible is not something we plan on necessarily, but we see it unfolding, and we can be prepared to say, yeah, I'll stick around after class. You're the gift, right? Maybe.
It's expansive way of thinking, right? So rather than shutting the door, you're looking at what door can open rather than, oh, there's no possibilities here.
Right. I think about this concept called anticipated qualitative experience. Anticipated, meaning you're somehow imagining that it's going to happen. And qualitative, meaning I'm letting go of the circumstances. I don't know if what I want is an Aikido class or to sweep the floor and be of service. But the quality of what I want is feeling connected to other people in community. And present as me authentically. So being able to see that unfold in a different circumstance was the key.
I love that example. It's great, actually. I'm going to be at a Kung Fu class, also a beginner class, by the way, in about an hour and a half.
Yeah, I find it really difficult as a practice, martial arts.
Yeah, I do too. I just hope that I remember the form next time I show up.
I've never been.
Well, okay, so let's talk about synchronicity then, and its relationship to physics, but in simple terms that people can understand. So, you just talked about coincidence and coincidence. For example, I went to a musical preview that I didn't know about until yesterday morning. And I don't know, maybe 2 hours before that, I had canceled or rescheduled a dinner. A couple was supposed to come over for dinner, and I moved it. So suddenly my Sunday afternoon and evening was free, and I could go and see this preview of a musical, and I love musicals. Mm-hmm. And then from there, I got another invitation to go somewhere for an unfolding of some kind of new movement yoga studio.
Wow.
And there's probably 40 people there, and I didn't know anyone in the room except for the friend who invited me. I knew no one. Mm-hmm. And this guy starts talking to me. We're in the back of the room near the food because I was starving. He was starving. And we're chatting. He's like, you look familiar to me. And I'm like, yeah, you kind of do too. And I told him my name, and he's like, God, that rings a bell. And I said, well, maybe from the tech industry. We're going back and forth. And it turns out not only had we met, like we've been on a yacht in the bay together, which only had like 8 of us on it. So it's not like it was a big yacht experience. It was during Fleet Week. And then he had introduced me to someone who was on our TEDx Berkeley stage. So this, talk about synchronicity. And then as a result of that, he's like, oh, you got to come to our conference in the fall. And, all of these things just kept unfolding. And he was giving me publishing advice for the book that I'm working on. And, had I not canceled the thing, in the morning that I thought it's not the right timing, the weather's off or whatever, which led to the musical preview, which led to the yoga studio opening and so on. So, it just kind of reminds me of that old movie, Sliding Doors.
Sure.
The movie where she gets on the train and it's one life. If she doesn't, I love that.
Yeah. And everything unfolds differently.
Yeah. So anyway, let's talk about it and its relationship to physics. So coincidence, right, has been around forever, and philosophers and scientists have wondered about it and debated about it and argued about it. The idea that can 2 events be related in a meaningful way without one causing the other? And if so, what does that tell us about the cosmos?
The key ideas are the following that I believe are applicable here. So the key ideas are on how we perceive time, how we understand time to be, not just our perception of it, but its very nature. We tend to think that time is reductionist in the sense of reductionism, that you can break something down to its parts. A coffee cup is reductionist because you can break it down into carbon and nitrogen and hydrogen and the chemicals, right? Are there things you can't break down to their parts? That's the question. And there are some things that I talk about in the book, but light is one of them. And the example I give, and this is the essence of my research that was published in 2020, that if you have light traveling from one point to another, say the sun to the earth, when you measure it, that's an 8-minute journey. So it takes a certain period of time for the light to travel that distance. But when you actually ask the question that Einstein originally asked, what if I were riding on the light? What would I perceive from the light's point of view? You have to be careful not to personify the light, right? The light doesn't perceive anything. But you can ask questions like, what does the light register as it goes from point A to point B? And it's well known and well understood that light doesn't register any passage of time because of the laws of special relativity. So how do you make sense then of this sort of non-controversial fact that for us, there's 8 minutes that pass from the light to go from point A to point B? But for light, it's one timeless event. Do you see that? Mm-hmm. So we have to interpret that and see if there's any implications for our understanding of space and time. And the conclusion that I draw is that this interval of space-time of 8 minutes is one whole unit. It can't be subdivided, because if you subdivide it, you could say the light was somewhere along the way, and then you'd have to say what time it was there. But there's no time possible because the light didn't register any time in traveling from one point to the other. So you come up against these contradictions that don't make any sense unless the interval of space is non-subdividable. So you get this idea that instead of being able to break everything down into pieces, you have to deal with things as a whole of arbitrary size, right? It could be coming from Andromeda galaxy, 2.5 million light years away. That whole distance is one whole unit for the light that's traveling. So how does this connect to synchronicity? We're basically saying that instead of looking at light as looking at time as a grain of sand dropping through an hourglass one at a time, you're looking at time as a line, like a film strip, which is what you even said. And in a film strip, we've got this extended dimension. The end is part of the story. So plot and story and theme and meaningfulness become part of that description right away. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, they're all connected.
And so when you have an experience at the beginning of that timeline, that film strip, that doesn't make a lot of sense, but is part of a storyline, which later leads to you making a new connection with this man that you used to know, you don't realize at the beginning that you canceled your plans because it was in a bigger context. So the context is later you're going to have this experience that's going to be more beneficial, and you got to make room for that.
Yeah.
So this leads us to this notion of context. Context is unfolding that we can't see, and that's where the synchronicity comes from. This connection over time that we can't see in the moment, which is back to what I said earlier about my initial inquiry into, the reality that we live in. What is the hidden underlying context that we can't see that's guiding our experiences?
If there's no future and there's no past, there is only now, then in some way, what we perceive to be the future, right, that time strip, the end of the time strip, is somehow the now in every moment that we're recreating.
Yeah, I like that image.
That's kind of the only way I can understand it, because with our linear constructs, it doesn't make any sense, right? So how can the future that doesn't exist impact the past and vice versa when there is only the present moment.
And there are traditions that have known this for a long time, like the Aboriginals of Australia have this notion of timelessness, where the past and the future are part of the now. And so to talk about the past and the present, past and the future separately from the now doesn't fit within that worldview. So in a sense, we are now rediscovering for ourselves, myself as a scientist, what is already known in many other cultures. And we do draw a lot of knowledge. I draw a lot of knowledge from Native American culture, where symbolic understanding of the meaning of animals or symbols in my life are synchronicities, which are part of that storyline that's unfolding. And I'm in the past or in the present, I can't see what that full storyline is, but the symbolism of an animal that I meet will help me understand what's unfolding.
Wow. Just as you said that, Sky, a huge hawk just flew by my window, and it was so close to the window. I couldn't believe how close it was and how big it was.
Beautiful. I feel honored.
Might you have called that in?
I was aligned with it. Let's say that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd love to now move to your latest book, right? Leap to Wholeness, which I couldn't put down, right? And as we were chatting about earlier, I first had the PDF and all the papers were scattered all over the floor, and I'm making notes. And so now all the notes are in here. But there's something I wanted to read from it that I just loved. And that is, you brought up Brian Greene earlier, and, this whole holographic universe idea, and, we are the universe, right? Deepak Chopra. I mean, this isn't new. Right. But it's relatively new, within the last 100 years. It's not like an ancient concept, even though, as you said, it is. The Aborigines and other cultures knew it. But in terms of us getting there from science in a way that will be respected and move beyond this materialist and reductionist thinking. So you write on page 96, we evolve with our reality and our reality revolves with us. And then you give this great example. When we anticipate having a certain experience, apples grow on those branches of the tree of probabilities. Well, actually, you say the tree of possibilities, but when we feel bad about something, that is the same as anticipating the outcome that we feel bad about, right? And how many times have we done this? The likelihood of experiencing a certain branch on our tree is influenced by those apples. Anticipating experiences is something that we do every day, whether we know it or not, and it often reflects our unconscious filters, right? Or I'll add our conditioning. And then later you write, this self-criticism, right, which we talked about already, can come at a tremendous cost to us. So if a parent yells at us for stating our opinion, which all of us have had, right, we may conclude that sharing our opinion threatens our safety. And so we stop speaking our mind around this person. And then silencing ourselves becomes who we are. The weather becomes the climate. I just thought that was beautiful, right? Because
thank you.
We've all gone through that. There's no person who's listening to this now. I don't care how many PhDs they've had or how successful they've been, that still probably doesn't get a criticism from a parent every now and then, and always has. And so
here's a criticism from a boss as a parent.
Right, exactly. It could be that as well. So why don't you talk to that about how we're recreating in every moment?
Yeah, what feels really useful for me about that example is that, as you quoted for me in the beginning, synchronicities are invitations for how the world could be. They're not messages about how the world should be or is. So it's up to us to make them actual. So if I'm anticipating the feeling of fear of or sadness or embarrassment of messing up a conversation, I am, in my model, placing apples to weigh down those branches in the future that have that happen. And that leads to the greater emphasis on those branches earlier in the time where something happens to invite that. So my microphone doesn't work, or, whatever. that happened to us. But those are invitations to follow that path. They're not destiny. So what I found to be even more profound is the self-love with which I approach the world determines which messages I pay attention to. So I can anticipate that I might screw something up, but then when the opportunity arises to have it actually screw up, I can recognize that happening and make a different choice because I don't see it as myself or as my identity to go down that path. Like last night when I made a choice that was sort of habitual to not go to Aikido class, I felt bad about it. And that was an invitation to go even further into feeling bad and feeling agony around that, internal dialogue. But I didn't take that invitation. I took a different invitation, which was more proactive. And it came from a deeper place in me that was like, I know what I want out of the situation. I'm going to do what I can do to lay the groundwork for that. I'm going to ignore the problematic invitation, the situation that was making me feel worse about myself. So we do have a choice to ignore synchronicities. And a lot of times I find synchronicities are negative invitations to, go down habitual pathways, invited to do something where, a habit we're trying to break. Or, I've had times when in my marriage, when it seemed like all the signs were pointing to like, I got to get out of here, that kind of thing. But looking deeper, I found that there was a deeper message for me. And I didn't have to pay attention to each little message. They were clues to help me decide what's true for me. And Satchidananda used to say, I can't believe I'm quoting him here, but he used to say, life experience is like soap. It's rubbing down the edges that are grimy or rough and washing them away or getting rid of those rough edges. It doesn't mean that everything that happens synchronistically is meant to tell you what to do. It means it's meant to be a reflection for you to learn more deeply who your authentic self is.
Oh, I love that. That's great. I mean, it's really the idea. It's not all about absolutes, right?
Right.
We kind of think when something comes up, there's either, a yes or a no answer, but there's all these layers in between.
Yeah. And finding, and then flow is this thing that emerges when we become able to accept our ability to make mistakes, our ability to try things that are new, all of that, and see the synchronicities as opportunities to go where we're not expecting.
And go where we never thought possible.
Mm-hmm.
There's all these layers that you hadn't even considered, right?
I had no idea that what I needed in Aikido was unstructured time with another student who is even more novice than me in order to get better, right? I didn't need more time with my teacher. I needed time where I could, with someone I really trusted at the same level as me. So unexpected, but it was a gift.
So I wasn't planning on bringing this up, but it's kind of a good segue to it in a way. I mean, you're kind of talking about that. Some people call it the internal compass. Some people call it intuition or intuitive abilities or clairsentience, right? Which is, this clear sensing or, clear tangency. There's all these different ways of knowing something at an innate level. So you're kind of talking about paying attention to those innate abilities that a lot of times we squash down and we don't pay attention to.
Well, what I teach in my own workshops that's really been beneficial for me is sort of like the negative space, right? There's a picture framed by negative space. And it's really helpful to me. There's a big movement in New Age philosophy to like name what you want and have a vision board and don't talk about the things you don't want to have experience. And I don't want the idea that I talk about anticipated qualitative experience to make you feel like you shouldn't have negative thoughts, right? Because that's going to place apples on the tree. So let's throw that out for a minute. Like, let's start from a clean slate. And what I think is really valuable for me is noticing and understanding what are the messages that I'm telling myself. And I call them filters. When you start with a whole piece of information, a whole data set, or the whole world, in order to interpret it, you need to filter it in some way, choose a representation that you see it through, like a lens. And anytime we take data from the world, when we interact with a friend or a family or whatever, we're interpreting it through our lens of our past experiences. We're ignoring certain hand movements they might make and taking in more relevance to their smile or not, or the words they say, and essentially making up stories that hopefully align with reality about what we're experiencing. And then from there, we're making choices to react, which create more synchronicity, right? And if we're accurately interpreting the world, hopefully the synchronicities will be more about connection and building what we want to, getting where we want to get to. If we misinterpret the world through our filters, we're going to probably do the opposite and create more conflict because we don't understand what the other person actually needs or wants, and we're misinterpreting. So it's really helpful to me to think about and notice the three things: the thoughts that we're thinking in a situation, the feelings in our body, like our emotions and where they come from, and then the physical sensations that we have. And those three things can really help, at least for me, identify a message. What's the message that I'm telling myself right now? One filter that I've taken away from some of my experiences growing up is this really clear little statement. These are little statements, right? Because it's our subconscious young mind that's saying them. And so the statement like, nobody wants to hear from me.
Mm.
So raise your hand in the audience if you have that message, in your mind, nobody wants to hear from me, right? Some people have that experience. And for me, it really affects the way that I interpret what you're saying and doing, Renee. And I have to be more conscious about how I interpret those things because I know I have a filter that says that to me. So I find it really helpful to identify what I'm doing that's negative, because it's not really negative, it's just data. If I know what I'm doing, I don't have to push it away. I don't have to prove that it's wrong. I don't have to convince myself that everybody wants to hear from me. I just have to be aware that that's what I'm interpreting. And that allows me to step away and sort of reframe it a little bit. And clairsentience that you're referring to and those kind of things, I tune into what is my body telling me? What's the messages in my head that I'm interpreting? And how do I test them for reality? And sometimes that allows me to see more clearly what someone else needs or wants and anticipate the future, anticipate what's going to happen next and how I can best serve the situation.
Do you ever try to analyze or assess where that filter came from? So, for example, going back and where that conditioning might have started from and try to nip it into the bud right away so that you're more aware next time it comes up.
Yeah, I'd say two things. One, that I do find it useful to understand the stories and where they come from. What my parents' influence on my life was, what my peers' influence on my life was. That one experience I had in high school where this and that happened, how that affected my sense of myself, both for expanding me and for contracting me, right? So I do find usefulness in that.
Let's take the leap to wholeness, right? Which was where I was going to go, and how you had given readers examples, which is one of the things I loved, right? Because, you're a physicist and there's a lot of data around that, that people can't understand, right? How many people can understand string theory? But you bring in really practical examples like photography and holograms and rainbows and music. Can you give us a couple of those examples that demonstrate the correlation to the wholeness? Hologram is obviously a really great one, as is rainbow, but, maybe in a way that people hadn't thought about before.
One that I'm just working on right now for my next book, I'll just give you a little taste, is for you musicians out there, think about an octave. Harmony is a holistic concept because it holds together as a whole structure. So an octave is 8 notes in our Western particular way of doing it. It's 12 notes chromatically and 8 notes in the scale. And if you go above those 8 notes and keep going up the scale, you don't get anything new. It's a repeat of previous information. And the really juicy aspects of harmony come from the relationship between like the root, which might be a C note, and the fifth, which is a G. Those have a really simple mathematical relationship of 3 to 2. So there's a structure between the octaves and the fifth in the middle that create a relationship that's very consonant and meaningful to us. And then there's the third, which is a 5-4 ratio, and it's the E, so you have a C, E, G, that's a C major chord. That's a set of relationships of basic fractions. And those all fall within a structure of an octave. So you can't break up an octave into half an octave and have it retain the usefulness of the harmonic structure.
Yeah, that's true.
You can't break it into a quarter octave because you lose the relationships of the whole. So that's an example I'm working with, which illustrates some things that cannot be reduced to smaller and smaller pieces. It's a basic unit that is a system that works together to define the relationships.
I like that. I'm a piano player, so I actually was following along with you there. So that's interesting, right? Because it's, especially with what's coming out now, research and data around sound as a healing modality, right? And how these notes are really frequencies that are affecting parts of our body and even our DNA.
And it's the relationships between them. I mean, I'm not someone who has perfect pitch, but I do have relative pitch. I can tell very easily what the relationship between the two notes are. It doesn't matter to me what key it's in at all, but I can hear the relationships, as many people can. It's a beautiful thing for me about harmony.
Yeah, it's funny. I never really understood. I mean, even though I'm a piano player, I never understood when a singer would come up and say, I need this in F. And I'm like, really? Well, I don't know it in F, or, just, can't we just do it in this other key?
Right. It's all relative.
I'm not a singer.
Yeah, vocal cords are not exactly relative in a certain size. But I can give you another example too that's in the book. You mentioned rainbows. And this is a really fun one that I got to dive into when I wrote the book. A rainbow is a beautiful example of light that we sort of take for granted, but we know it's a mystery, right? Because we know that it's not really there. It moves, like if we're driving in the car and there's a rainbow on the side of the road, it moves along with us. How does it do that?
Yeah.
And is there really red light and blue light in the sky? Like where is it? It illustrates a much deeper aspect of light that has really been a fascination for me. And I think is underexplored, even though we know a lot about light. And I do some of that ongoing research and I write about it in the book some, but there's more to do. And what I love about it is, one thing you can say is that the white light coming from behind you, from the sun, bouncing off a cloud and refracting into different ways, different directions. So where you see the red, it's because the white light has been filtered such that the blue and the green and the yellow were removed. What's left is red. The red was there before in the white light that was traveling from the sun. But you removed everything else and it revealed the red. And you reveal all the other colors by removing the colors that are not it. And I think it's a beautiful example of this idea that instead of starting, how many of us start with the assumption that if we do nothing, nothing will happen? If we don't work, we won't have any money. If we don't clean our house, it'll get messy and fall apart. If we don't work on our relationships, we won't have any. If we don't speak, no one will understand who we are. And that's starting from this mindset, which is like the Big Bang mindset. First, there was the void. And then everything exploded into existence from somewhere, some principle. There's another way to look at it, which is holistic, which is that we start with everything. And then we start to remove pieces that aren't relevant to our vision. And we reveal the colors or the shapes or the personality that we want to emphasize.
Wow, I love that. Yeah, I really love that. You did actually, now I'm thinking back, it's something I read in your book a long, long time ago, but you were giving an example. I think it was a music example where you were taking away pieces to hear something. It was something that it was a musical example that you had given.
Well, that's where I started getting into the Fourier transform, which enlightens all my work in physics, from music, because you start with a waveform in space time, and then you convert it into the frequency representation. So you see the high notes and the low notes, and you don't see where they are in the song, but you see their frequencies. And then you can start to carve away what you don't like. If you start with white noise, white noise is random, every frequency possible present, or something like that, I guess. And you can start to carve away what you don't like from the white noise and retain beautiful tones. There's beautiful music within white noise if you just remove the parts that don't match the music.
Fascinating. And I love that.
There's this basic fact for you engineers out there, basic fact of the Fourier transform, that if you start with if you want to get a single point in the time domain or the space domain, a single electron, for instance, a single where there's vacuum everywhere, but one thing in one point, the frequencies necessary to create that is an infinite spectrum. So there's this confusing and counterintuitive notion that in order to create the simplest little point, which is the essence of most, 19th to 20th century physics, right? Particle physics, it takes every single frequency possible to do that, which is like a universe full of noise for every particle. So we're not creating from nothing. We're actually carving away from everything to reveal finite reality.
Right. We have access to everything too. We have access to more than what we can see, as Cynthia Bourgeault so beautifully and eloquently puts, like those subtle realms and dimensions. We have access to them, but it's just a frequency that we haven't tapped into or that we're familiar with.
I'm not familiar with her work, but it sounds intriguing.
Yeah, she also used to speak at SAND, right? When SAND was physical, but she's really more of a theologian and an academic, but she kind of talks about these subtle realms, and then brings in traditions, right? Ancient traditions to kind of explain them and how we all have access to them, right? We just call them something else. And she never uses the word frequencies, but if you think about it, right, we're photons. And this is something that, people who are not physicists are becoming aware of that we're photons, we're light, we're energy. But what's the practical use of us becoming aware of that? If we're more aware that we're photons, we're light, we're energy, how can that deeper awareness help us shift how we show up in the world?
Yeah, I think what I find really useful, and this comes from my mixing of my grandma's Jewish background and having abandoned it for science, mixing with the Satchidananda yogic integral yoga history. I leave space for the possibility of many theories and many possible ways of looking at things. And I find the practical approaches that we can actually make a difference with are actually within reach and still pushing the boundaries. So that's where I come back to, what am I noticing about my own filters that's allowing me to not allowing me to see what's possible here? Because when we become more able to see what's possible, for me, it's just transformed what I actually get to experience in terms of positive experiences that I want to have. And I don't need to look at like secret powers or deeper abilities. It's like looking at my own emotions and my own relationships. There's so much available if we just tap into the synchronistic possibilities that are already emerging for us. And they're coming out of the whole, right? If we see our environment as one big whole system, which is evolving together like a film strip, then the characters that come out of the film strip are part of us. And we can't see them coming, but there they are.
Yeah, that's the interconnectedness of all things. This is a great segue to my last question, actually. And that's about this idea of probability. So for someone like me who's really more right brain, and I'm a creative person, right? Also a musician. And so this idea of unlimited probabilities that we can tap into, right? Every quantum physics book I read talks about this.
I'm going to disagree from the start, but I'll come back to that.
Yeah, so you're right. In Leap to Wholeness, it's as if the universe is on autopilot whenever we are not around to observe it, like traveling along many potential branches, but not choosing an individual one. Now, the next part is brilliant. Loved this analogy. You write, our interactions are like fence posts that determine the ultimate path of the fence, but leave it freedom in between. And then between these posts is a vague description of what could be happening, which ultimately means that there's no reality, only probabilities upon probabilities. So can you expand upon that? Because this is something I spend a lot of time thinking about.
Yeah, I call this the fence post version of reality, or fence post version of time. And I find it really useful at a practical level because it reminds me that whatever experience I'm having right now is like a fence post. I'm actually having it. I don't need to question whether this is real. This is my subjective experience. I don't need to pretend like there's infinite possibilities. I can just be aware that from this point moving forward, there are more possibilities than I realize. Because my usual approach would be to assume I know exactly what's going to happen next and limit my filters to just control the future, which doesn't allow for anything other than what I'm expecting, and usually causes arguments with my wife or my daughter. So instead of going for like infinite possibilities, starting from where we are at this fence post, what can I do to take away my assumption about certain things that I thought were going to happen a certain way? And that allows for the space between the fence posts to be actually undetermined. So I'm just trying to think of an example. I'll tell a brief story. So I was at a time where I was wanting to go to more conferences and give speaking and stuff like that. And I went to a conference and there was a hot tub that I was going to take at night. This might have been in the book. And I went to use the hot tub, and on my way there, I found out it was broken. So I was going to go back to my room and change my clothes and read a book and go to bed. That was my version of reality. But was there anything else possible? By allowing myself to go from the fence post into the unknown, this rail between the fence posts, I was talking with somebody for a brief moment in the courtyard, and a stranger from across the courtyard said, "Hey, you guys, why don't you come join our party?" And it was another conference that was happening on the same location. And I was like, I don't really want to, but that is more in alignment with my goals as an author and as a songwriter, as a singer, as someone whose spiritual path is about expression, right? And connection. That was more aligned. So I took a deep breath and adjusted my expectations. I went back to my room, changed my clothes, got my guitar, and went to their gathering and found myself in a totally new experience that I wasn't expecting. That was another fence post. And then from there was like another rail of me just being in the unknown of who I met, who I talked to. We played some music. And the last person of the night that I met was this guy named John, who turns out he was, not a physicist, but had got bachelor's in physics and had studied a lot, read a lot. So he was really interested in what I had to say. And we had a great conversation. And he has a speaking group, and I was like, I'm going to stay in touch with you. So then another period of time goes by between this fence post and the next one, where I suddenly get out of the blue a message from my friend Janet saying, "Hey, we have a speaker series and there's a cancellation for this weekend. My friend John, who's the other board member, mentioned your name." And I said, "Sky? We got to get him." "Yes."
Wow.
So all these, the space between the fence posts unfolded in a way that I didn't have any idea was possible. It's not that everything was possible, but there was a lot more than I expected.
Right.
And so if I realize I'm going from fence post to fence post, I can allow the unfolding of unknownness in my life in between and feel at ease with that, feel comfortable, and maybe show up with an open mind when things don't quite go my way. Right?
Yeah. Well, I think about it as, kind of the observer effect. We observe, but then if we're just looking at it, right, that's one probability and possibility. Yeah. But if we look at it intently and more expansively with glee and excitement and energy, then suddenly that observer effect is more expansive. And then we get, that's the way I kind of look at it in my non-physics perspective.
Right. I like that. And if you look at it for a moment and make your effort, like you reach out by email to somebody or you send in an application, you do your fence post, right? And then you pull your mind away and focus on the rest of your life and be happy and work on yourself and develop your relationships. And then find that you come back to the next fence post when you least expect it. And you get a response and you're like, I allowed it to unfold when I wasn't observing.
Yeah. I mean, that's letting go of the outcome, which is really the message of every sage and mage, but it's also the message of people who teach about manifestation. You got to let go of the outcome, right? Which is so hard for us to do as human beings.
That was something
I know we're kind of running out of time here, so I don't know if you have time to just touch on this, and then we can just briefly talk about your Synchronicity Institute.
Sure.
Just briefly, if you just want to talk about the wholeness in the brain. And the reason I'm particularly interested in this, and I didn't want to forget to bring it up, is that we had Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor on the series who wrote Whole Brain Living, right? And she's a Harvard-trained neuroanatomist and talked about how connected our brain is. And then, of course, you bring it up in your book. So do you want to just briefly talk about how our brain is more whole than we think it is and led to believe, maybe beyond time and space as we come to understand it?
Yeah. As a non-neuroscientist, I'll just invite people to take these as ideas and reach out to me for more conversation. But I've been fascinated with the Fourier transform since I was a kid and learned about it in relationship to music. As a musician and recording artist as a kid, I was like, any way I can learn to manipulate music that was not obvious was super cool. And I gradually came to learn that the brain operates via similar properties. Like the eyes, I think, are reducing the amount of information they take in by converting in Fourier transforming into the brain. And this is just a theory that I had personally, and I learned about Karl Pribram's work, where certain patterns like zebra stripes, which are very regular patterns in space, appear as specific points in the brain or something like that. Whatever I say in the book is correct. It's been a while. And but it points to this idea that the brain sees patterns and that the brain is patterns, is encoded via patterns. And it's only recently that I was delighted to find an article, because the technology's caught up, that they can actually do MRIs at like the fast enough rate to create movies of the brain patterns. And they show, if you picture a drum head vibrating in spatial temporal modes, they show that the brain is doing the same thing, oscillating in Fourier modes. I think it's Fourier modes. I'm not totally sure what the decomposition is, but just as many of us were, imagining, there's this resonance happening in the brain via the structure of neurons and how they're connected, how they've been trained to be connected over time.
They've been trained, yeah.
And so we don't have memories in a specific location. It's an oscillation that's set up, which triggers another oscillation, which leads to another oscillation. And that's the association of one memory with another. Ray Kurzweil gives an example that is like so obvious, but I was totally unaware of it. If you say the alphabet forward, it's pretty easy. If you try and say it backwards, you can't do it. You have to think about every single letter, because the brain associates, it recalls one thing from the previous thing.
Yeah, that's true.
It's a chain, it's a relationship. So we don't have access to like data automatically. We have to get there via association. So I think it really ties in nicely with this notion of wholeness. The brain exists, the information in the brain is distributed throughout the brain like a hologram, I imagine. Again, I'm not an expert, but it's not in a specific location. We have to stop thinking about locations and reductionism in terms of breaking things down into pieces and look at what do they mean as a whole? What does this pattern mean as a whole? And I would say, just to tie it back to my biggest purpose, which is that the patterns of ourselves in our lives are similar. They're playing themselves out over time, the same pattern again and again in different ways, different situations. Our relationships are undergoing similar patterns every time, whether it's our dad or our mom or our kids or our boss or our partner or our friends or strangers. We're having our patterns are the central piece of that equation. So the more we can see how the world, synchronicity in the world shows up to show us these patterns, for me, I get to be more grateful, even when I have people in my face, because as Satchidananda taught me, it's not about them, it's about me and what I'm taking away from that situation. What is it teaching me about my patterns that I can find useful to make my life better? And I'm the one that gets to choose that.
I think the other piece to that is when we can become aware of those patterns, or I would say the conditioning, right, around those patterns, we learn how to more proactively make choices to heal the traumas, if you want to call them traumas. I prefer another word, dark night of the soul, whatever you want to call it. It's unhealthy, right? All of these traumas that are accumulative lead us to living in dysfunctional ways that are not harmonious for the whole. And so when we can become better aware of, which is, a lot of what your teaching is about, then we have these choices, right? You talk about healing as a way of living.
Right.
It's a choice.
A journey.
Yeah, a journey in every moment.
There's a word, by the way, from Freud that I learned from my new book, signal. These events in our lives, synchronicities, are often signals, which are like triggering us, but signal is a nice kind of soft word that isn't too that is easy to point and say, yes, that experience was signaling a part of me that wants to respond this way, or signaling a part of me that says I have to do this, or I'm compelled to take this action. And when we see these signals coming at us all the time, we can start to say, oh, I don't need to respond to that right away or in the same way that I thought. So
I like that word. I mean, it's, because you hear the word trigger, which is kind of what, that's the word that people use all the time. It's a trigger, but really a signal is a whole different, you said, it's softer, like you said, there's just something more positive about it.
Neutral, maybe,
Neutral, yeah.
I am getting a lot of signals from the world all the time, and I get to take responsibility for how they're affecting me at least to some degree in some situations.
Yeah, healing is a way of living. So lastly, tell us about the Synchronicity Institute and, of course, the course that you're working on that people can take.
Yeah, the Synchronicity Institute is my organization, which does both research. I just am in the process of publishing a paper on time, the recursive nature of time. So I'm passionate about doing that academic research. And I also lead trainings and build courses, which turn that into tools that allow us to analyze our own patterns and see them more clearly, and then maybe choose something different or find ways to escape from a certain part of our life that's making us unhappy. Escape is the wrong word, but evolve our lives and grow and be on a healing journey, whatever that means for you. So the course I just relaunched is called the Living in Flow course. We changed the platform to a new platform that's more interactive, has a community chat board, and I give weekly talks on that, which are a lot of fun. And but it's a lot of great information, and we've made it completely free. So people can go to livinginflowcourse.com and sign up. And there's a lot of videos and exercises for personal growth.
Awesome. So we will put that link up on the screen so people can just go there directly. They don't have to dig around for it. And we'll also be putting links to your work, the Synchronicity Institute, and of course your books, right? Where people can buy them, because they are really, like I said, I really just couldn't put this down. So, and really you certainly do not have to be a physicist to get through it.
That's the hope. One guy I gave it to who reviewed it, very grateful for him. He's a marketer, does not like physics. And he said his review, which is in the book, says, this book is very dense, but on every page, there's something of value.
Yeah.
So I was very touched.
I agree with that. What a pleasure, man. Just such great content and information. So this has just been such an honor to have this time with you today.
Thank you, Renee. I really appreciate how long it took us to get here and how nice it was to be with you. How do we get around our filters? Filters are ways that we get stuck in ruts of perceiving and thinking. And one way to get through that is self-compassion, or compassion in general. So this is what I have to say about that. Self-compassion is a gift that we neither understand nor observe, nor deserve. We don't have to earn self-compassion. It is not a reward for good behavior. Even with our many faults, if we are compassionate with ourselves, our hard edges will gradually become softer and our problems will ease. This is the essence of grace. We don't have to ask for permission to be compassionate with ourselves. We don't have to have a certain GPA or salary. We can choose to be compassionate with ourselves anytime. This doesn't free us from consequences. Rather, it helps us fully account for our mistakes. Self-compassion brings humility and makes reconciliation possible. Self-compassion is a practice. Even the act of not being compassionate gives our critic ammunition against us. You should have been more compassionate with yourself. You'll never get it right. How do we escape this perpetual loop of self-critique? This is my experience. I don't know. I have to share it. Self-compassion is a leap. It's the leap to wholeness.